to spend a little time just trying to create a discussion and a background for how we speak and view these issues of health, well-being, welfare, and productivity. As mentioned, I've been involved in pigs most of my life of one sort or another, starting out and scraping down the pens in the morning. But sometimes we haven't explained what we do and how we do in enough detail. I grew up, as mentioned, in a rural area, and one of the characteristics of University of Minnesota, especially the College of Veterinary Medicine, is that it's in an urban area. And for this country boy to end up in a city has been a real eye-opener. And I want to share some of the ways that we've discussed and presented the issues that we have in pig production to you as well. Just to start off, this is entitled, Wendell, I'm Not Contented, or I'm Not Content. And the point is that we've often presented the issues in rather simple concerns. And so we do have advertisements about contented cows, and we do have simple presentations of animal agriculture that doesn't really present the true issues that we have in place. The other thing I want to emphasize, and I'm dating myself a bit, but things aren't the way we thought they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. This is entitled, Say, What's a Mountain Goat Doing Way Up Here in a Cloud Bank? And the challenge that we have in simple terms is something we call the burden of proof. That when my dad farmed, and he retired approximately 20 years ago, he would never have allowed an auditor onto his farm. And the simple argument he had was, if I have lost the trust of the consumer, if people don't trust me, what am I doing in this business? And we're past that now, aren't we? The burden of proof in animal agriculture is on us to prove to a wider segment of society that we are doing the right thing. And I'm going to discuss that a bit more, but it's not only what we present, it's how we present it that is important. And these criticisms are coming from various sides. And in some cases there has been validity, but in other cases they are quite misguided. I have participated in a number of different committees that have focused on animal welfare and particularly pig welfare. The thing I want to point out is the great majority of these groups have some sort of acronym, that they're organizations that are looking across a broad range of issues and are often involved in different areas, whether it be National Pork Board, whether it be the American College of Animal Welfare, whether it be the Food and Animal Food and Animal Organization. We have challenges in those areas, but we have to look more closely what's happening on the farm and contextualizing what we have on the farm rather than simply describing what we have in committees. And me being in academia, we're not doing that great either. In some of our pig pens, we're now seeing these certified big red apples showing up. It's a piece of plastic that looks like an apple and it smells like an apple. And it's argued to be there for animal enrichment. No one has ever tested whether these actually work. But out of some sense of logic, and in some cases some sense of guilt, we're being prescribed interventions such as this. And hopefully, my dad would have never agreed to buy these things for $60 a piece, but hopefully you don't have to get to the point of agreeing to buy them either. The other aspect that we have, and we can't forget, is when we talk about pigs, various images come into mind. And as a veterinarian, various types of pigs are brought forward to me as well. Not only domestic pigs, but there's pet pigs, there's wild pigs, and each one of those has its own challenge in definitions as far as welfare goes. I was involved in a case a number of years ago now where a hunting preserve bought a boar from a neighboring farm, dropped it into the hunting preserve, and then sent out a boy, I think he was 12, 13, with a pistol to hunt this boar. And they went even further, and you may have seen some reports in the news of the monster pig that was hunted. And they claimed it was a wild boar, when in fact it came at the sound of the feed pail. And on top of that, when the boy hunted it, he did a gut shot, and it took a few hours for that boar to die. And the basic question was, is this inhumane? And the answer was, well, if it's a domestic animal, then it's against the rules of euthanasia and care and slaughter of animals. If it's a wild animal, we don't have those rules. And so we had to decide, is it wild by definition of being in a hunting preserve, or is it domestic based on its history? And our recommendation was we should consider it domestic. But in the end, the Attorney General didn't want to bring an argument about hunting hunting logic or hunting rules just before an election. The other part I'm involved in is a number of different academic organizations and groups. And you have to watch us academics. We tend to dig into stuff in great detail in one specific area. You know the old meaning of PhD, piled higher and deeper. But it's in a very vertical and distinct area. So if you get a bunch of academics together arguing what welfare is, we each emphasize our own area. And so an expert in one area will say that's most important, and an expert in another area will describe the elephant in other details. And so, again, sometimes we rely on outsiders to define what's important. So I'm going to make 3 points in this presentation. And if it sounds a bit like a sermon, maybe it is a bit like a sermon, but there's 3 points. The first argument I'm going to have, based on way too many committees, is that welfare is about pigs and not public relations. I've been in too many meetings that are welfare meetings when in fact they're how do we address what the outsiders think, rather than first of all asking what do we think about the welfare of our pigs? What do we think are the challenges? Secondly, is that I want to argue that we have an obligation in this industry to act as individuals. I'm going to argue that institutions do not carry the ethics. National Pork Board cannot be expected to be the ethical interface of discussion. It's each of us. It's on a personal basis that it comes back to the person, to the caregiver, to the farmer, to the stock person. And to do that, we must go back to the definition of expertise as being at the level of those who give the care to the animals, those who work with pigs day in, day out. And I think this is very important, and I'm going to give you illustrations of that, where in many ethical considerations, it does come down to exactly that level of expertise. Probably one of the most difficult things that I try to do is argue that welfare is about economics, unless you're an economist. That there's an unlimited demand to improve the welfare of pigs, improve the protection of the environment, of the community, of safety and the like, and yet the amount earned per pound of pig isn't that much. And thus there is inevitably a prioritization that we have to go through. And who does that prioritization? It's the producers. It's those of you on the farm. And so when we ask, how do we make the decisions on what is the best practices on the farm, we have three choices. The first is to argue profit comes over everything, and in turn, there's specific welfare rules that everyone has to follow. I actually call this the just spank me approach to animal welfare, because it reminds me of my young son who got caught teasing his little sister. And I tried to do the modern parent thing, sit him down and start discussing with him all the ins and outs and considerations that he should have. And guess what he said? Why don't you just spank me so I can go outside and play again? And producers are sometimes like that as well. Just tell me the rules, let me go back into the barn, and let me do it the way that you've agreed that I should do it. And you're just subjecting yourselves to more and more rules if you take that aspect. I'm arguing something called an optimization model with values placed on welfare. In other words, it's a complex decision on what is right, how we do it, and we need to constantly discuss and refine what we're doing. It's never going to end, our pursuit of improving the welfare of pigs and doing it in the right manner. It adds complexity. It adds discussions and meetings and time to reflect on what we're doing, but it has to be that way if you're going to maintain the power of decision-making in your own community. Because the worst one is, as I mentioned earlier, is treating welfare as a marketing problem. Because by defining it as a marketing problem, you've defined it as an externally run organization. To argue economics is uncomfortable, especially in a very rich society. As mentioned, I spend quite a bit of time in Central Africa and Southeast Asia. And the first time I went to Democratic Republic of Congo, I had to come to the realization that the gross domestic product per person was about the same as it cost to raise a pig in Minnesota. In that there isn't enough money. And in that turn, we have to recognize that there are priorities not only on the farm, but in a broad society of, first of all, protecting children, of providing vaccine, nourishment, and the like. And other species do not get the same care, and there's a competition for resources. So if it's welfare policy, and welfare policy is applied to a population. It can be to a population of humans, it can be to a population of pigs or wildlife or whatever. We take those scarce resources and do the best job we can. It's implicit that we won't do a perfect job, that there just isn't enough resources in humans or otherwise. Historically, we've modeled it across one species. In other words, what's the best for a group of people? To a lesser extent, what's the best for a group of pigs? And now we're asking to address it not only across pigs, but across humans, across the environment, across safety issues and the like. And there's going to be trade-offs all the time. And we're going to be learning as we go along. But if we take a close look at who administers welfare policy, as mentioned, you can argue it's the government. Just make the rules. There's non-governmental organizations that are getting involved, or international government organizations such as OIE, the WHO of pigs, that are making rules for transport and want to harmonize rules across different countries. There's marketing chains, of course, that we hear from time after time that put expectations upon the supplier. But I'm just emphasizing it again, it's the farmers, it's the stock persons that actually apply the decision making, that you take what you have in the morning and do the best job that you can before the lights go out at night. The other reason I'm arguing a farmer-centered argument for expertise is take the example of a hospital. Very few people express allegiance or trust in a hospital, especially if it's an HMO. The allegiance is almost always to the individuals, to the doctors, the nurses, the people who work day after day in that institution. And we have to create some of the same relationships and understanding of the people who work on the farm as well. And the other reason I like the hospital example is an issue in welfare that we haven't addressed very well is the question I have, do we improve welfare by moving the average, in other words, moving the average condition of the pigs, or is this actually a focus on the outliers, the poorest doing the most compromised animals? And if you look closely at the criticisms of animal agriculture, especially showing up in videos and the like that we see time after time, and for disclosure, I work to create public commentaries with a number of other people, we see that it's the treatment of the compromised animals that often gets the most criticism. And I should say not only treatment, but lack of treatment as well. And how do we do that? This is an example some time ago now of a submission to the Attorney General in South Dakota of pigs that should have been treated, separated, or euthanized. And frankly, it's the existence of these pigs on the farm that creates the most concern. And we see usually some criticism at that level. And interestingly, in videos, though it's mentioned, not much focus is actually given on housing methods that we often hear the criticism for. And on top of that, there's often comparison against more extensive operations. And I can disclose here, I worked with this farm early in the 90s in North Carolina, and it was an attempted answer to concerns about animal welfare, except that we had mortality that was very high, and we ended up with a farrowing rate of about 20%. And can anybody recognize the problem in raising pigs outdoors according to this picture? I always ask the students, sometimes producers can get it better. It's the showers on the top. Took off all the mud, and the pigs got sunburned and aborted on that basis. It got better afterwards, but we got it up to about a 60% farrowing rate and couldn't make it sustainable. The other aspect we have to admit, and I see time after time in discussions, is that we have to admit we look kind of ugly, but the pigs look cute. And we have to explain our relationship with pigs, and I can entertain school kids for time after time of just describing what pigs can do and what different food products at the same time come from them. Teachers get uncomfortable, kids think it's great. So let's analyze this a bit more, and I'm going to get into some graphs. I'm going to get into some definitions of what we tried to do in explaining what's going on the farm and where the holes are. If you have followed animal welfare and the discussions at all, this list should be quite familiar to you. It's called the 5 Freedoms. The reference we used was 1993, but it actually got developed in the 60s and 70s by John Webster in England. And he lists 5 categories of freedoms. And it's freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury, or disease, freedom to express normal behavior, freedom from fear and distress. And pretty universally agreed upon. Probably the biggest challenge time after time is the freedom to express normal behavior, this 4th category. And if you take a look at the language being used, it's the one category that isn't freedom from. And we understand the freedom from and the freedom to express suggests that there's something behind it as well. So we keep on going through exercises with these 5 freedoms. And we ask, what are we actually measuring and defining as important according to those 5 freedoms? And we end up with a list that usually looks something like this, that there's freedom from thirst, freedom from hunger, from malaise, from feeling sick or feeling malnourished, from discomfort, from pain, and then there's a boredom that we think is the closest explanation of the condition that the criticisms or the desire for normal behavior actually is in place. And then there's fear and distress. And so it's a relatively short list, and we should be able to measure it. Now the question is, why would we measure these conditions? Are they signals for something important? Because the other challenge we have with this list of 5 freedoms is always asking, are they all equally important? Is pain as important as boredom? Is fear as important as hunger? And we've done some measurements there. There's many different mechanisms to measure what some of the concerns are for animals. This is a modification of a Skinner box that is used for mice, and it's a combination of an adverse condition such as shocking versus a lever to get some food, and you can start measuring, so what do you think is more important, to get your food or to avoid that pain? Sounds pretty nasty. In some cases it has been in the past. But similar experiments have been done on pigs as well. And just for an example of this list, what do pigs try to avoid more than anything else, at least our domestic pigs? What shows up time after time is hunger. Pigs will spend so much time trying to get food that we've actually measured and shown that pigs will expend more energy to get food than is in the food, which is quite a biological statement. The reason and the argument for these states, why do you feel pain? Simple answer. When something, if you put your hand on a burner, pain tells you to pull back. And it tells you faster than your sense of smell to say, hey, something smells funny. That it allows an animal to start functioning and surviving in areas, and feelings have a purpose. Stan Curtis argued this for a long, long time. And he argued that if pigs are functioning fine, then they don't have adverse states signaling them to do something different. And Stan Curtis argued that for quite a while, and it's pretty similar to evolutionary biology that simply argues that adverse feelings, hunger, thirst, pain, are there to protect the animal, to ensure that it's operating correctly. And yet we get criticisms time after time asking, is this a natural state? And there's a large argument whether or not the pig as an organism will tell you or tell itself what is the correct state, or you have to rely on philosophers, teleologists, ontologists, actually asking what is natural, what is right. Is it, do pigs have to be on pasture, for instance? If you go back, there are 4 basic functions to flourish, that you're looking for 4 activities or signals for activities. First of all, an animal has to eat. There has to be feeding. Second of all, it has to fight off challenges, compete, adapt to difficult circumstances. It's not only other sows that can cause damage to a sow, but heat is there, that there is disease, that there are bad floors, and they have to work on that part. And they have to adapt to those circumstances. Or there's flight. They can move away from those conditions as well. They can avoid those difficult circumstances, move to another part of the pen, find a warmer area, get their feed in another form. And finally, they have to reproduce. They have to replace themselves. And if you take a look at those priorities, reproduction falls off relatively quickly if they can't meet those first three outcomes to actually survive. So if they're failing, it's either due to the fact that, or they're not thriving thriving and surviving, as Stan Curtis would say. It's due to the fact they're either not getting enough food, they're not absorbing it right, they can't adapt to adverse conditions, they can't avoid those adverse conditions, or they simply can't reproduce. And those inhibitions usually come in terms of physical things, such as bad penning or mixing. It can be environmental, such as temperatures, cold on a day such as this. It can be infectious. Other diseases come in, such as PEDV, and it can be other pigs as well, that the competition between pigs is quite significant. If there's mechanisms of those functional inhibitions, another way of breaking them down is to say that, first of all, there's physical, that they don't want to move, that they can't move, they can't eat. It can be inflammation. Inflammatory responses are designed to slow down the pig. When a pig gets sick, it stops eating, it stops moving, it's trying to get better, and of course it stops reproducing as well, and it moves off into the corner of the pen. And pain is just another example of more detailed inhibition in some cases, for instance, of reproduction. So let's take a couple examples of that inhibition. Let's take a sick pig. Why is a sick pig a concern for welfare? Why is it a concern for the well-being of any number of participants in that care? And here's an example. Actinobacillus pleuropneumonia. Interestingly, in babies, pleuritis is considered one of the most painful, distressful conditions, and painkillers are often recommended, as well as sedatives. I don't know how many of you have had pleuritis, but you can imagine someone who doesn't understand that if you don't stop moving, you're just going to feel worse and worse. And disease is often an example of a welfare concern, and quite severe welfare concerns in many cases. I get in arguments sometimes whether disease is a welfare concern. And it took me a while to understand it, because I'm saying it fits all my categories of what welfare is about. And the argument about disease is that disease is not the fault of someone, that it seems to be a culpability concern, that you need to blame a person for it before it's a welfare problem. And I would argue that's, to me, a slippery slope, that we have to take a true concern for all aspects of pig care. And I don't think that's a dangerous position to take. When there's welfare meetings from vegetarian societies or vegan societies or animal rescue groups on campus, I usually go. I show up, and they all grumble now when I show up in the back row, or even sit in the front row if I feel particularly feisty. But my rules are, first of all, to thank them for their concern about pigs, because they are well-meaning kids. And then they give criticisms, and I explain some of those concerns, and then I load on as well. I've got these other concerns as well that are more important than your concerns. And let's talk about them too. If you consider gestation housing a concern, let's talk about lameness. Let's talk about other conditions. And they get excited to a certain extent about that until they can't blame it on the man or other entities. And then I finally say, if you have further discussions, you really need someone who understands what's going on inside the barn. So make sure you invite me again. They usually don't, but at least they quiet down to a certain extent, because we do have a number of challenges. Another one that we've been working on for quite a while is lameness, especially in sows. And again, an example of a welfare concern, in my opinion, that has to be addressed. And it fits really well into comparisons and understanding of physical inhibition. If you think about the claws of sows, it's like walking on your broken fingernails when you have breaks in the claws. How can it not be painful? And when we take a look at the biology of this, we understand that the sow puts an extraordinary amount of pressure on very small areas, and we have to provide that health in quite a bit of detail. And on top of that, we see the animal trying to fight against certain conditions with inflammatory response. This is a dead sow. We took off the claw, and we show in this area that there is actual inflammation. And I don't know if you've ever had a sliver that got infected underneath your fingernail. It's not comfortable, and it has to be a concern. And of course, we have general conditions in sows, such as fighting, such as agonistic behavior, but often we find in those sows as well, when there's fighting, there's also real damage on the claws of the animals. And so we have to ask, is this an important welfare concern? How important is it to the sows? And we start doing some more analysis. Now the statistics part. Coming back to my original question, is welfare about moving the average or bringing up the bottom? Taking into account the extremes. I'm arguing that it's taking into account the extremes, the poorest animals in the group, the knotheads, the pigs that should be culled and aren't. And it's really, as this book says, we rely on averages too much. Average daily gain tells you something, but I'd like to know the average daily gain of the bottom 10%, 20%, and figure out what creates those pigs and what we can do better for those animals. The big pigs are beating up the other ones and doing fine. The other problem is dead pigs that die naturally. And this is an example from the Flaw of Averages that says the state of the drunk at his average position is alive, but the average state of the drunk is dead and nowhere to be seen. So just by doing pictures of what's going on the farm, especially audits, doesn't really tell you how many compromised animals were in the farm and either died, were culled, or removed to another site. And we need numbers in many cases to understand what's going on. And there are real big levels of diversity, not only in mortality rates, but also in euthanasia rates, which is essentially an accelerated death. I was unpopular in National Pork Board many years ago, probably about 12 years ago, when we originally made swap, that my suggestion was we should ask producers to at least euthanize 25% of their mortality. That was hugely unpopular because everyone came back and said, why should we kill another 25% of pigs? And my point was, if you think they're going to die, help them along as a major part of our responsibility for care. And we don't work very well on that part. Here's the challenge with productivity, with understanding what's going on the farm. If we, and those of you who don't like numbers at all, you can sit back for a little while, but I know a few of us do. This is a discovery for me. We looked at lame sows, we looked at low productivity, which meant a much reduced likelihood of producing another decent-sized litter. And we asked, based on that predictiveness, should the sow be culled? If we followed lameness, lameness explained low productivity, and it was actually the lameness that was a better predictor of whether or not the sow should be culled. If you did a good job on your record-keeping systems in understanding your lameness. In fact, most of our record-keeping systems simply look at low productivity, and instead low productivity predicts the need to cull an animal. And that's important to me because we got to look further back. In biological terms, sows just don't change into a low productivity animal. They change because something physically is going on. And in this herd, it was lameness. And we were much better off addressing the lameness problem than we were just culling low productivity animals. And understanding the cause, and behind it in many cases, is inhibition of the animal to reproduce simply because the body is telling them there's more important things to fight for, such as health, such as reducing pain, such as aggression, than actually spending it on reproduction. Here's another example, and one that I get involved in quite often. And to describe the curves, this curve is showing if an animal comes in, if a pig comes into a nursery at about 17 days, 17 to 21 days, at 7 pounds or less, it has about a 90% chance of either dying or being a lightweight pig on the way out of the nursery. So the question is it worth putting that pig in there? And I would argue that economically there's real questions there, but also on a welfare basis. This is a pig that's not coping with its nursery, with the environment of the nursery. And if we go to 8 pounds or less, we see that proportion going down, and 9 pounds or less, if you got rid of them, you'd get you'd have about 65%. You'd get rid of pigs that have about a 65% likelihood of being a poor doer or a dead pig. The other way of looking at it is 7 pounds or less covered about 50% of the total mortality and poor doing pigs in that population. In other words, if we got rid of them, we got rid of 50% of our problem. If we went to 8 pounds, we got rid of about 70% of our problem pigs. There's real prediction there, and there's details in our record showing where animals are not adapting. They're not coping, and in many cases, their body is telling them they're not coping either. And examples such as this abound if we look at individual animal records, because welfare is about individuals, in my opinion, and not about averages. Just another example, and challenges we have all the time, for instance, understanding electronic sow feeders. And we've done a number of different studies on that basis, understanding where injuries occur. In this case, simply looking at the vulvas of sows. And when they got big and pendulous, they started getting torn, especially in gestation. How important is this? Probably not that important, but it is a measurable and it is a concern. Another example coming out of our data for risk. When do sows die? When do they fail at coping with things such as temperature, infection, lameness, and the like? And we see a peak here time after time shortly after farrowing. And this little peak here, if you follow the numbers, is shortly before farrowing on the subsequent cycle. That there are real challenges there, and we can focus our care efforts, taking a look at pain control and taking a look at infection control and the care that we give to pigs. Just one more example from our records, and this is an old one, and a number of producers are doing better. But we simply asked for the red lines, when do pigs die by day of the week? And you see that Sunday is the lowest. It can be a record-keeping problem, but it goes up on Monday when we actually, in some cases, catch up with them, and it goes down from there. Euthanasia follows a very similar line. What I wanted to point out was, euthanasia does not follow a similar line in that euthanasia rates are much higher during the week than during the weekend. And we have a challenge on many of our farms having enough resources to actually apply euthanasia decisions within 2 days as our guidelines expect. So hopefully I've given you a few challenges. And this says, that's pork, the meat of the pig. It makes an excellent substitute for tofu. And that's my hope going to some of my neighbors for dinner. Give you one example of visiting my neighbors for dinner. And I live in the city, close to campus. And I went to dinner, and my neighbor said, big treat today. We're getting cage-free chicken for dinner. And hopefully some of you are smiling because my wife immediately said, keep quiet. Don't talk about this. Because as most of you know, we don't raise broilers in cages. And the only other choice is that we were eating an old spent hen of one sort or another. And so it was a broiler. It was very good. And I finally had to say, do you understand that all broilers are not raised in cages? We just don't use it for that. You paid a premium for a non-existent quality. And she was sort of upset about that, and I said, should you really be upset? Because now you know that all these broilers don't live in cages. And she said, yes, but I want to do better than everyone else. That there's a competition in welfare as well, in consumption, that we have to address and we have to understand. So I'm going to give you one final lesson, and it's one I give to students all the time, and it sounds rather academic, but in sermon sense, it's rather basic. There's a narrative and a story we have to tell about pigs and taking care of pigs. And according to Aristotle many years ago, and still according to marketing people these days, there's 3 parts to a good story that we have to take into account. First of all, and we understand this very easily, there has to be a logos. There has to be some logic or reason involved. And most of us have that in spades. We can do that easily. But secondly, we have to have an ethos. We need to have an ethic associated with that. And we have to create that association with our audience. It's based on the character of the speaker. And finally, there has to be a pathos. There has to be an emotion. And that's the hardest part I've had to learn in explaining what we're doing on the farm. That I have to get mad sometimes when I see things that are wrong. I have to get happy when things are right. I did a presentation for a group one time on Christmas in the fairing room. And just explaining how things are really quiet at night and the piglets are suckling, that it can be just really good, and you want to do your checkup in the evening. And I remember my mom always wanting to do that late in the evening to get her rest and to get back home and know that everything is all right and things are in place. But understanding those emotions and sharing those emotions as being an important part of storytelling. Because we all want to be logical. We all want to have someone else as the expert. We all want the scientist to be the judge and take it down and say, this is right and this is wrong. But wrong and right are involved more now with the character and the expectations of the people involved than simply based on science. I just threw the last point in as a joke. There are 3 types of persuasion. If you are a classically trained orator, ethos, pathos, and logos. If your training was obtained in modern times, you have an additional tool called statistics. And statistics hasn't done us very much in this area. The other last point is always focus on the outcome. And we're in a renaissance as far as the place of pork in diets. And the nice part is with my neighbors, can usually find a good piece of pork now showing up. I'm going to leave you with one last quote. And this is from John Webster, who actually created those 5 freedoms that take us to task and also challenge us. Someone asked John Webster if he was really serious about calling them freedoms, and because they're an impossible list to meet all the time and in every place. And he actually admitted that freedom was a bad choice for Americans for a word. Freedoms in the U.S. tend to be in terms of absolutes, where in some other countries they're more in terms of relative guidelines and priorities. And they don't work as absolutes, but they work as aims. And he uses this quote quite often in his presentations. It is comfortingly easy to care about animals. To care for them requires skill, patience, and humility. I'll leave it at that. Hopefully I've challenged you with some ideas. And if you have ideas and challenges in the future, you can contact me through the website at University of Minnesota, a number of different contact points there.